Hello and welcome to the next video in the Virtual SG series. The theme of this tour is Western exposure. It begins as usual at Tourism Core on the outskirts of Orchard Road. A long coach journey transports visitors to the western end of Singapore for Jurong Bird Park. Another stop is made adjacent to the park at Jurong Hill. On the return part of the trip, we visit Tiong Bahru Estate and Market. This happens to be the itinerary that I was murdered in for my assessment. In contrast to the Eastern and Southern exposure tours, the Western exposure does not pass through the city proper, meaning the standard rule of Orchard, Istana, and Bras Basah does not apply. The coach takes leave from Tourism Court at Orchard Spring Lane. And immediately turns into a very residential part of the area on Grange Road. Here, condominiums and bungalows stand alongside embassies of countries from all around the world. This area ranks as one of the most sought after and expensive places to live in because of its proximity to the city and the exclusivity of the neighborhood in terms of quietness and tranquility. In fact, for a long time, the Sultanate of Johor owned a large estate not far from here, near the current Botanic Gardens. Take a look at the condominiums around you, going at about $2,000 per square feet. A one bedder should set you back $1.5 million, making every owner a millionaire in assets. Despite the price, another advantage of purchasing a unit in these areas is that many of these properties are freehold, meaning the ownership is in perpetuity. This is a legacy of the British colonial administration because the lack of land in modern Singapore means that new lands purchased from the government are leasehold in nature for up to 99 years. What happened here and also on Irwell Bank Road and River Valley Road was that enterprising developers purchased land from individual homeowners when it was still cheap and redeveloped them into high rises for profit. Some of these old houses are made obvious by their shorter height and can still be seen at Grange Road and along River Valley Road. at heights of just 2, 3, or 4 stories. Singapore acquired its independence in 1965, and the business of redevelopment started taking prominence with the growth of the economy beyond shipping. The age of the buildings are not only reflected by their heights, but also by their facades, as glass and steel gain favor over concrete and masonry. The shophouses at River Valley are of the modern style, brutalist and functional, typical of the 1950s and 1960s. Later at Tiong Bahru, we will discover more about different shophouse architectures, especially the very popularized Art Deco of the 1920s. For now, get ready as we take a peek while crossing upstream of the Singapore River. From here, it is 3.8 kilometers to the Malayan and mouth of the Singapore River. Notice now that the gated communities of glass-covered apartments have faded away into open Spartan ground surrounding brutalist high-rise buildings. These simply designed and functional structures are one of the first social housing blocks built in post-colonial Singapore in the 1960s. They are identified by flats on one side facing a long common corridor. The agency responsible for these flats is the Housing and Development Board, and traveling along Lower Delta Road gives a perspective of how these flats have also changed over the years, growing taller and looking less and less different from private apartments with larger windows and air conditioning ledges. The most recently completed ones in 2007, just after Zhengde Primary School, is one example of the transformation. The social housing provided by the Housing and Development Board is home for 80% of Singaporeans. Unsurprisingly, it is also the largest developer in Singapore. In contrast to the million-dollar condominiums of Orchard Road, houses here fetch about $900 per square feet. A two-bedroom apartment or three-room flat might be somewhere in the range of $650,000 depending on its age. Another thing that sets the Housing and Development Board apart from private developers is the scale of development undertaken. Whereas private developers concern themselves with a few blocks of residential buildings, the Housing and Development Board looks at development from a town scale. In designing and allocating land for development, the concept of a satellite town is used. Such a town is self contained, with amenities, shops, and industries that pander to a resident's needs. In theory, it is possible to stay within the satellite town to go about one's life without having to head down to the city center except for the most important errands. Not only does such a concept reduce congestion in the city center, it also makes such towns located far away in parts of the island, like the West, for example, more desirable. Light industries are found alongside the Ayer Raja Expressway in close proximity to the housing estates. The scarcity of land, with the island measuring just 700 square kilometers, means that even factories have to go upwards. Beyond the tall hedges and trees that line the expressway, catch glimpses of these flatted factories that today are home to all kinds of industries, from automotive repair to storage, distribution, and technology. Such will be the pattern for most part of our journey along the expressway. Industries, residences, and repeat. One iconic residence facing the highway is the Interlace. This 1,000 apartment complex, looking like a set of Jenga blocks stacked on top of each other, typifies private developments of today. In trying to set a higher premium for the property and distinguish itself from the improving standards of social housing flats, developers often hire renowned and usually foreign architects to come up with ideas. In this case, German Oleg Scherin. Marina Bay Sands by Israeli Moshe Safdie is another famous example. Another way developers try to luxurize the development is to use fanciful foreign sounding names that taxi drivers may have trouble pronouncing, like Lviv, Vox, and Tresalvo. In the early years of Singapore's independence, our economy has transformed manifold. Beginning with heavy reliance on import and export given our position at the Malayan Peninsula, focus shifted toward labor intensive manufacturing, such as textiles, toys, and appliances, to provide jobs for the many. As labor became scarce and standards of living rose, attention shifted toward higher value products and services such as finance, technology, and medicine. The economy is now heavily diversified with many focus areas, all achieved not from within, but with generous incentives afforded to international companies willing to relocate here. An arrangement similar to the Housing and Development Board exists for companies and industries in the form of the Jurong Town Corporation, now JTC Corp. This agency facilitates the relocation of companies by providing amenities and ready to move in places for a fuss free start to business operations. Much of their developments will be visible along the way to our next stop, Jurong Bird Park. This was because the western part of Singapore was the least developed part of the island for most of our history, making relocation of visitors for factories easy. The Science Park and One North are two examples of specialized industrial areas set up by JTC Corp for companies to enjoy economies of scale in their production. The Science Park is home to research laboratories and pharmaceutical companies such as Johnson and Johnson, while One North has an incubator precinct for startups known as Block 71. Creative Technologies had its origins in one of the little units at Block 71. These industries are supported by institutions such as the National University of Singapore nearby. The institution, which was founded in 1905 as a medical college, is now a full university that ranks as one of the best in the world, with facilities ranging from architecture to business, engineering to music. Notice the increase in the number of heavy vehicles on the road as we enter Western Singapore officially. Many of Singapore's heavy industries, such as petroleum, steel, and shipbuilding, are located on the western end. Much of the coastline and offshore islands have been given to factories in these fields of operations. These vehicles are likely on their way to one of the many factories carrying supplies for production. Further inland from the coast, where ships may not pass, two major towns anchor as population centers. The first town is Clementi. This town is the closest major town to the National University of Singapore and also to many institutions, including Singapore Polytechnic, Ngee Polytechnic, Singapore University of Social Sciences, and SIM University. As such, there is a large student presence in the town centre. The adjacent town of Jurong is divided from Clementi by the Pandan River. which this expressway crosses. Jurong Town is slated to be Singapore's second central business district. It takes its name after the Jurong River now dammed to form an inland lake. Over the next decade, the area around the lake is expected to be transformed into a second Marina Bay. Already, several government agencies have relocated offices to the town centre. The section to the right of the expressway was originally earmarked for a high-speed rail terminus connecting to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. The project is in doubt pending renegotiation with Malaysia. As we exit the expressway on Jalan Ahmad Ibrahim, take in the view of the surroundings. Low-rise but large factories dominate as opposed to the stacked ones seen earlier. Stacking industries that are pollutive and intensive in nature poses additional risk to fire safety. Our first stop at Jurong Bird Park may then beg the question of the oddity of the park's location in the middle of an industrial estate. The idea for a bird park came from the man credited with the transformation of Jurong from swamp to factory, Dr. Goh Keng Swee. He was inspired by a trip to an aviary in Brazil and the cheapness of bird seeds. As a way to attract dignitaries and people to visit this part of Singapore, he conceived Jurong Bird Park together with Jurong Hill and its lookout tower. Opened in 1971, the park remains the largest of its kind in Asia. The park is home to over 400 species of birds from all over the world and over 160 species of heliconia plants. The 5,000 birds that call this place home will, however, be moving to a new park in Mandai by 2023. For now, the park may be broadly divided into four major zones: penguins, lorries, waterfall, and the lakes. The penguin zone, aptly named Penguin Coast, is a cold room holding penguins from the southern hemisphere. A fun trivia fact is that penguins do not exist in the northern hemisphere. The king, macaroni, Humboldt, and rockhopper penguins are all put together in a cold room fashioned like a ship. At the lorry loft, colorful brush-tongued parrots fly freely below the nets. They coexist with their smaller cousins, lorikeets, both of which love honey and making plenty of noise. The waterfall aviary is made spectacular by the spray of its 35-meter high waterfall. Simulating a rainforest environment, more than 600 birds roam freely within the aviary. Finally, the lakes play host to large colonies of pelicans and flamingos from both the Americas and Africa. Flamingos get their pink plumage from their diet of animal and plant plankton. Kids will find entertainment and education at the Birds of Play water park, and research and breeding center, respectively. While the two shows, Kings of the Skies and High Flyers, further demonstrate the abilities of the genus of birds. The right to our next stop is a short climb up the slopes of Jurong Hill or Bukit Perupuk, 60 meters in height. Standing alone in the midst of a sea of factory sheds and silos, the hill is a remnant of what Jurong used to look. Imagine the landscape of Bukit Purapuks, one after another, then leveled and whose excessive spoils are pushed into the sea to create new land for factories. All of this happened in a relatively short span of 20 years between 1961 and 1981, and the hill provides a vantage point in which to take in what was once Go's folly and now Singapore's economic miracle. This hill, while green and leafy, like most of Singapore, is no ordinary hill. For one, many of the trees planted here began as seeds sown by foreign dignitaries, VIPs who had come to visit this part of Singapore. Amongst the famous persons are Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip, President Suharto of Indonesia, President Ferdinand Marcos of Philippines, President Deng Xiaoping of China, and others. Many of these trees were planted between 1970 and 1980, making them nearly 50 years old. That was the time that Singapore's tree planting movement was in full steam in an effort to make the island a garden city. Not only was the tree planting by VIPs a nod to the city's push to be clean and green, it was also an opportunity to show the guests the opportunities presented by Jurong Industrial Estate. A total of 27 trees were planted in the garden. The adjacent observation tower, spiraling up 3 stories, offers a southerly view of Jurong coast, particularly Jurong Island, an amalgamation of several offshore islands. This restricted island is home to most of Singapore's petrochemical processing facilities. Despite not producing any oil or gas, the Republic is a major refiner of oil and gas products in Asia, accounting for 1.5% of the world's refining capacity. The stability and security offered by the country makes it a favorable candidate amongst foreign investors who do not wish to sink huge capital investment at risk of uncertainty in policy and safety. Over 100 companies have facilities on the island, including ExxonMobil, Shell, and Chevron. Beyond what is visible, the island hides another open secret. Huge caverns up to 27 meters high, half the height of this hill, have been dug underground. They have space to hold nearly 1.5 million cubic meters or 9.5 million barrels of liquid hydrocarbon. It epitomizes the tagline, passion made possible. This is a place where dreams can become reality. On this return trip, the coach bus is expected to travel the same way for most of the journey. What has not been said, including the housing, car ownership, and tree protection schemes in Singapore, may be mentioned en route. These three subjects have easy examples that often will appear while trundling down the highway back into town. The housing situation and home ownership schemes available have been discussed in videos prior to this. The car ownership and traffic management system has also been mentioned in earlier videos. The tree protection policy is enshrined under a unique legislation called the Parks and Trees Act. This act specifies tree conservation areas in Singapore and elevates certain trees to heritage status not much different from national monuments. To date, two tree conservation areas have been identified in the central and Changi areas. Property owners with trees exceeding 1 meter in girth must obtain written approval to fell the tree, even if it is within their property. Meanwhile, heritage trees have a girth exceeding 5 meters or some form of community value, for example, as a landmark. These trees are nominated into a special register in which greater care and attention is given, including the tree's own lightning protection system. There are currently 259 heritage trees listed in the register. The route begins to deviate just after Lower Delta Road into Central Expressway, where we enter Tiong Bahru Estate from its eastern limits. While part of Tiong Bahru's name in Malay means new, it is in fact one of the older housing estates in Singapore. Parts of Tiong Bahru came into being at the turn of the 20th century with the first social housing flats constructed by the British Colonial Authority, the Singapore Improvement Trust. At that time, the city centre was facing an enormous shortage of housing, with dozens of families sharing the upper stories of shophouses in towns. The unsanitary and overcrowded conditions create opportunities for epidemics such as cholera and influenza, which was bad for business. With the general hospital nearby and Tiong Bahru not far from town, the Singapore Improvement Trust started constructing social housing with what limited budget they had. As can be seen by the Art Deco design, much of the budget was allocated to the architecture of that era. The smooth curves and sleek flowing sunshades and slabs in a movement known as streamline moderne are a marked contrast to the no-frills housing blocks of later years. Typically, such designs are more commonly reserved for transportation buildings, making the collection of 20 blocks here even rarer. Unfortunately, the Singapore Improvement Trust overran its budget in building these flats, pricing them out of the reach of the people they were meant to serve. The more well-to-do bought the apartments and used them as a base, fulfilling their extramarital affairs with their mistresses. The once gritty and seedy neighborhood saw intense gentrification as artists and Art Deco lovers moved into the estate. One by one, traditional shops were replaced with funky restaurants serving cyclists and families coming in for a morning of coffee and brunch. It was the failure of the Singapore Improvement Trust that saw the Housing and Development Board replace its mission. As people moved into newer houses constructed by the Housing and Development Board nearby, the Tiong Bahru Market came into being, gaining reputation with time for its great food and fresh produce. Despite its Art Deco looking facade, the current market building was completed in 2006, rebuilt, and expanded. The expanded floor space meant the market was less congested, less claustrophobic, and more airy than before. Fresh produce has also been separated from cooked food, with the latter occupying the upper floor. Unlike supermarkets, each stall is individually owned, the space obtained by auction with the National Environment Agency. A wealth of products may be found here, including fruit, flowers, eggs, meat, fish, and apparels. The small size of Singapore and its population density means the country imports over 90% of its food from overseas markets such as Malaysia and Indonesia. The impact of the COVID pandemic and the supply chain disruptions it has caused has forced a rethink on the issue of food security. The Singapore Food Agency has set itself a tall order by working towards 30-30, which aims to produce 30% of Singapore's nutritional needs locally by the year 2030. Similar to the concept of vertical gardens on buildings, vertical urban farming is gaining traction as a measure. Using indoor multi-story LED lighting and recirculating aquaculture systems, high-tech agri-farms are capable of producing yields 10 to 15 times more than traditional farms. Some of the vegetables grown include spinach, tomatoes, and kale. Off the coast of Johor in Singapore, fish farms produce barramundi and red snapper. At present, locally produced vegetables and seafood account for only 14 and 8% of local consumption. Eggs do better, with 3 egg farms accounting for about 30% of eggs consumed in Singapore. A high-tech agri-food zone is being allocated in the northwestern part of Singapore to meet the 30 by 30 goal. The western part of Singapore represents Singapore's industrial heart as the powerhouse of her economic miracle. Where large countries have arable land to feed their citizens, the smallness of Singapore has meant taking an indirect approach to obtaining food through industry and prosperity. In this way, Western Singapore's Jurong Industrial Estate has become a breadbasket of the country, attracting companies from near and far to put their eggs in our basket. This is not so different from migratory birds stopping over to nest and roost, much like the birds at Jurong Bird Park. While the west side is not as common a stop as Marina Bay for the first time visitor, there is no denying that if not for the western part of Singapore, downtown Singapore would not be as glitzy and glamorous as it is today.